Today, Michael Musgrove, who is a junior majoring in political science, he will be talking about the Unicameral Legislature in Nebraska. Feel free at any time during the presentation to go get more food, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, so I guess the first part that I should do here is make sure that everyone knows what the unicameral legislature is. So that's by a strict definition, UN is one, cameral is house. So it's just a single house legislature that exists on the state level. And to be clear, I'm only talking about the state level here. I'm not talking about a national unicameral in any way when I'm talking about this. This entire presentation is specifically about the state level legislature. And Nebraska is the only state that has a unicameral. Every other state has a bicameral legislature. So before I get into anything, this is just a quick outline of how I'm going to go about the presentation, just so you can follow along a little bit easier. I added the stuff in about Kansas at the end just because it's where we are, so I figured not everyone here is a Nebraskan, not everyone knows about how we do things, so I figured it'd be cool to show what kind of it would look like or how it would be applied and if it would be a thing in Kansas. So if any of you are from Nebraska, do you know where McCook is my first question. Or even if you're not from Nebraska, you know where McCook is. Okay. George Norriss is one of the more famous Nebraskans, which I don't know if that says something about Nebraska, that someone who's not very widely known outside of the state is one of our most famous people. But he is one of our most famous people. He was a national legislature, but he was a Nebraska representative, and he was a very, very large proponent of the unicameral legislature. Before he came back and started fighting for it at the state level, he actually visited Australia, and through that visit and seeing how they modeled theirs after the British system, kind of pushed him to want to push for the unicameral here. He argued that the bicameral was much more modeled after the British parliamentary system, where they have the upper house and lower house of the House of Lords and House of Commons, than it was after different kinds of representation. He just thought it was more of a tradition thing, and it was a tradition that didn't exist here, because the entire idea of the parliamentary system of the House of Lords and House of Commons in England was that there were two different classes of people, that lords were of a different class than the common people. So he argued, again, in this quote that you see, that we are all Americans. We aren't separated into that class system, so we should not be represented twice and be redundant in that way. So he led the effort to get the unicameral legislature on the ballot. Happened in 1934, and honestly, it was just kind of a perfect storm of things that happened all at once to make it a thing that could even really pass. Because, like I said, George Norriss was incredibly popular throughout Nebraska. He actually spent so much time driving throughout the state, fighting for the unicameral legislature from courthouse to courthouse. He wore out 2 different sets of tires on his car. He did a lot of traveling. He fought for it a lot. And aside from that, 1934 is like right after the Great Depression, is like just in the midst of it. And any way we can cut costs at the state level is being thought of and really, really considered. So, cutting down and completely eradicating one part of the legislature is a good way to cut costs. So people were like, okay, I'm good with that. And the other large part of it, which I thought was pretty funny, was that in the same election that this was on the ballot, another amendment that was on the ballot was to allow horse race gambling in Omaha. And there was a lot of people in Omaha that were really, really fighting for that amendment to be passed. And just to be sure that it passed, all the proponents of it just said, pass every amendment, so you make sure you don't miss it. And it ended up where the unicameral legislature passed through the general electorate of Nebraska with a vote of around 210,000 to 190,000, which is the population of the state at the time. So it was still pretty close, but it really was just a perfect storm to get it passed through. And after being passed in 34, it took place in 37. So just to look at some of the initial stuff, the last bicameral session in Nebraska took place in 1935, and again, the first one took place in 37. As you can see, of course, drastically cut down on membership. When you eliminate an entire house, you lose a lot of people. We lost a lot of committees. It was argued that a lot of them were not super needed. And of course, there's more committees at this time in Nebraska than there were in the 30s, because there's a lot more people, there's a lot more things going on in Nebraska. We move forward, we grow, we have new things. So there's a lot more than 18 committees now. But at the time, it drastically cut down, and they argued just cut off the fat of the state legislature. And as you see there, it was also a lot more efficient in its bill passage. There was no need for the same bill to be passed in 2 different houses. So if it did make it through the one house, then it became a law that went to the governor's desk, and that was also, more efficient. And aside from that, again, as you can see in the total cost on the bottom, basically half the cost of the state legislature. And while $100,000 may not seem like a lot, that was a lot of money in the 1930s. And that trend has really continued, where our legislature is generally one of the more efficient ones in the entire nation, probably the most cost-effective legislation in the entire nation. Today, most Nebraska legislatures make around $10,000, $12,000 a year, working part-time, between 60 and 90 days, depending on the year that the session is in. But of course, efficiency and cost effectiveness are not the only considerations when you're talking about legislation. Government, as you all know, is notoriously not very efficient, but that's because there are so many other considerations that we have to take into account when we're talking about legislative affairs and government in general. Transparency and accountability have always been a very large part of what we want in American government. We want to be able to see what legislators are doing, what they're fighting for. We want to be able to hold them accountable for any decision that they make. And that can be a lot easier in a unicameral. One of the biggest things that was fought against with that exists in the bicameral, that was fought against with unicameral, was conference committees. So if you don't know a whole lot about how state legislatures work, if a bill passes through one house, a similar bill will go to the other house. And say they pass bills that are a little bit different, they end up with a conference committee to kind of settle the differences, and then they come out with a uniform bill that has to be voted on as it is. There's no discussion once that conference committee makes its adjustments to it, and then that bill is just voted on completely. So all that deliberation that comes out with that final bill is held in a private meeting where you don't really know what's going on, and it's just a few legislators that can have a lot of influence on them from outside lobbyists. So this is a thing on the national level too, but especially on the state level, conference committees are very, very important and very, very powerful. So the unicameral sought to eliminate that and make all the deliberation on the floor of the Senate so that it was very, very public, that you saw what people were arguing, that you saw the changes that were being made. And when a bill was being passed or when it was being struck down, the legislature couldn't say, well, you can't hold me accountable for that because the bill that I wanted passed through my house, but then they changed it. Because whatever they vote for or against happened in that house, they had full say on what happened in there. They can't blame it on the other house for the ineffectiveness, and generally it makes it so you can hold your representatives a lot more accountable. Another big argument was that the balance of power was kind of out of whack at the time. At the time that the Founding Fathers created a lot of these systems, they saw the legislature as by far the most powerful of the three branches, the one that was the most dangerous. So the bicameral did help with that, especially on the national level. But to put it in perspective of how important they saw the legislature compared to the other two, in the early history of the United States, there were numerous people who were given an opportunity to be appointed to the Supreme Court. And instead of taking that, they chose to be in the House of Representatives because that was seen as much more important, much more prestigious than being a lowly justice, because the legislature is important. Since then, the legislature has drastically been decreased in power, and part of that has been because of the bicameral legislature and how there's just so much infighting inside of the legislature that it really doesn't even have a lot of time and energy left to check the other two branches, because it spends so much time trying to check itself. So the idea of the unicameral was that we would get back to the actual purpose of those checks and balances, to where the unicameral legislature would have the power that the legislature is supposed to have, but then the governor can still veto, the state Supreme Court can still rule something unconstitutional, but the legislature is where the power should be when it comes to lawmaking, and they should not be bending to a governor or to an activist state Supreme Court. So while some bicameralist proponents will say that the unicameral puts too much power in the legislature, I would say that it puts it back where it should be instead of splitting it up where it has been. And then the last note that people will say is the idea that the unicameral doesn't give really proper representation of what you actually need at the state level. Because while George Norriss argued that this system was modeled after the British parliamentary system, you could also say that it was very much so modeled after our national system, where we had the compromise of two houses, one for geographical reasons, one for population reasons. So you could say that a lot of the states just kind of modeled it after that. So it wasn't just the parliamentary system. That was probably just an argument that you made. But I'll get into it in the next slide a little bit. But the representation at the state level may not be what you think it is. So again, the intended purpose of bicameral at the national level was to have the different kinds of representation, one by geographical measures and one by population measures. So as you probably know from your middle school history class, we had the Virginia plans and the New Jersey plans. The Virginia plan was generally accepted by larger states. Virginia was the most populous state at the time that this was thought of, and they wanted more representation for more population, which they thought made sense. But then you had states like New Jersey, Rhode Island, that were like, no, we're just as important of a state as you are. We're all equal states here. So New Jersey came up with a plan where each state would get one representative, and that was going to be it. They were all going to be equal. And there's a lot of infighting about this, and that led to the Connecticut Compromise, otherwise known as the Great Compromise, which basically found out our legislature that we have at the federal level, where we have the two different houses, one where each state is equal, and one where population is king. So that is the idea behind our two houses at the national level, but at the state level, it is a little bit different than that. I have in quotations there, one person, one vote. That is an idea that has been around for a very, very long time. A lot of big proponents have gone back to the 1800s, but it saw a resurgence in the 60s with those two court cases you see right there. So the first one I want to talk to you about is Baker v. Carr. The general question in Baker v. Carr is redistricting a political question or a legal one? So Charles Baker, and this happened in 1962. Charles Baker was a Republican from Shelby County, Tennessee. He was also the mayor of a town in that county. But he sued Joe Carr, who was the Secretary of State for Tennessee at the time, because he believed that the state needed to redistrict all of its state area districts, because at the time, again, this suit happened in 1962, they had not redistricted since 1900 at that census. And his district had grown 10 times the size of some of the rural districts in Tennessee. So he argued that they should get more representation, and that by the state constitution they should have been redistricting already, and that it really was just unfair that these rural counties with so many less people were getting much more representation in the state legislature. So this case went to the Supreme Court, and in a 6-2 decision, it was decided that redistricting is a more legal question than it is a political question. So it made it so federal courts could get involved in redistricting cases, which was a really big deal. And it made it so that basically we can almost force states to redistrict when the population changes, which is why today you'll see all states redistrict after the census every 10 years. And who goes about doing that redistricting is a big argument that happens every single time, because usually it's the legislature that's in charge of that, and if it's a red legislature, they're going to gerrymander and all that stuff, but I'm not going to get into gerrymandering here, because this case was not about gerrymandering. It was really about redistricting to make it so that districts are much more equal in representation of what they actually are at the state level. And second, I have Reynolds v. Sims, which happened in 1964, so the 60s were a busy year for this, or busy decade, not year. And the basic idea behind this case was, in my opinion, the biggest reason why a unicameral makes more sense today, even than it did when Nebraska passed theirs in the 30s. In Reynolds v. Sims, it was argued that in the Alabama Senate, because that's what the argument was in. Sims was a taxpayer in Birmingham, Alabama. In their constitution at the time, it was, in their Senate, every county got one representative in their Senate. No matter the population, every county got one rep. And that made it so that at its greatest, there was a difference in ratio of 1 to 41 in some counties, but they were all getting exactly equal representation in the Senate. So this case was taken to the Supreme Court, and as you can see there, Chief Justice Earl Warren said legislators represent people, not trees or acres. Legislators are elected by voters, not farms or cities or economic interest. So in this decision, which was 8-1, it was decided that no matter the House, at the state level, legislators needed to represent decently equal districts population-wise. So as it is today in all of the United States, no matter if it's a bicameral or unicameral, in Kansas, in the Senate, all the senators have to represent about an equal amount of population, and in the House, all the representatives have to represent about the equal amount of population. That amount is different, but I would argue that it's largely arbitrary depending on the state, because you have two houses that are both based upon population, which is not how the federal government was set up for this bicameral. That was not the intended purpose of the bicameral in the United States, and it's just kind of gone that way, and most states have just kept bicameral because of the history behind it, and they believe that, they don't want to try to change the system because they don't. A lot of it is that they don't want to legislate out their own jobs. It's hard to make an entire house of people pass something that says they're not going to have a job next year. But it happened in Nebraska, so it can happen elsewhere. The other thing I'll say about Chief Justice Earl Warren in this decision is that he later said that of all of the decisions he had on the Supreme Court, this one was the most important in his eyes. He saw it as having the greatest impact on the future of the country, as it ensured better representation and better democratic processes for generations to come. So now I want to show you how the Nebraska legislature looks right now, since I've been talking about history for a lot. We have this handy-dandy map that you can see. So these, and the other thing about Nebraska is we call it just most Nebraska is called the Unicameral, but they're all technically senators. We don't have representatives, so our house is just the Senate. But this is how our map looks right now. Obviously,
It's not coming on the screen here.
Oh, is it not?
Are you trying to show the link from the
Yeah.
PDF?
Okay.
You thought you were on a double white screen.
So anyway, that's how the Nebraska districts look right now. As you can see, it's pretty heavy in the Lincoln and Omaha area. Nebraska has 49 total senators, and of those 49, 28 represent Lincoln or Omaha. And again, many would argue that that kind of hurts the rural populations in there, but no, Lincoln and Omaha do make up almost 2/3 of Nebraska's population in those two areas. And I'm from the 44th district personally, Chase County, up down there in the bottom left. It's where I grew up. And again, the argument of this isn't very representative of the rural population, I would say back that in both houses in every state, it's the same way. It's just different amounts of population per legislature. In all states as it is currently, the makeup is something like this. And some people would say, well, doesn't that make it so that Lincoln and Omaha have basically complete control over the state legislative process? Believe it or not, despite how big they are pretty split on a lot of these issues. Lincoln is predominantly red, but they have, I believe, 3 of their 9, is what it is up there, are Democratic senators, and Lincoln is majority blue. No, sorry, Omaha's majority blue. Yeah.
Aren't Nebraska's senators, though, aren't they officially nonpartisan?
Yes, that was another part of it, and I have that in a later slide too. They're officially nonpartisan, but in essence they are partisans. They do get endorsed by the state parties. So we know the affiliation of all of the senators, but they do not officially run as members of their parties. They run as nonpartisans, which I'll talk about again later. But we have a top two primary system where without your party listed, just the top two vote getters in the primary, it could be two Republicans, end up on the ballot in the general.
Michael, you may have already said this, what's the target number in terms of the districts?
Like how many there are?
Population-wise? No, I know you've got 49.
Oh, yeah, I have that
What's the
later
number?
in. It's about 30,000 in Nebraska.
What's the total population of Nebraska?
Around 2 million. It's a little bit less than Kansas.
Yeah.
So you should be able to just minimize that and to get back to it. You might be regular.
I can't even see the numbers.
So basically it's, there we go.
So again, officially there are 49 nonpartisan members because when he imagined the system, George Norriss that is, he imagined it as a nonpartisan unicameral. So that's how it works in Nebraska, and I would say it works well. The idea was that he didn't want a lot of partisan squabbling at the state level, and there is some. That's kind of unavoidable, especially in this day and age. But he did want representatives to truly represent their areas, not just the statewide party interests. So again, we have de facto 30 Republicans, 18 Democrats, and 1 independent. And again, most of those Democrats are from the Lincoln-Omaha areas, but both of them are decently split down the middle between Republicans and Democrats, so they by no means control the state legislature themselves.
So even though they're nonpartisan, what does this do to Norris's vision in terms of reducing partisanship?
I mean, you can say it reduces it a fair amount because you don't end up with for sure a Republican versus Democrat in the general, and the generality of a primary is that they'll run to the extreme and run back to the middle. So you could say that in the primary it helps a bunch, where you get the actual top two choices instead of just one from each party. Say there's two really good Republicans running in the same district. You could have both of them actually in the general, and then they would have to appeal to the entire population instead of just the Republicans. So in certain cases, it still works pretty well. It's just when they get there, they usually split along party lines. But there tends to not be a ton of political gridlock in Nebraska, just what happens.
What if you were to try to apply this unicameral legislature in like California or something where it is like completely one-sided almost, do you think that it would still pan out?
Believe it or not, California is not actually really one-sided. Like Los Angeles County and San Francisco are very, very blue, but most of rural California is really red. You wouldn't think it, but most states are not really uniformly one color or the other. A lot of states do have pockets of different political beliefs all throughout it. There are states that are pretty, some states are decently uniform in some of their thoughts, and Nebraska has always been thought to be one of those where we're decently uniform in our thoughts. But Democrats are rising in numbers in Nebraska currently, and they seem to be gaining a little bit more influence in there. You could say that in a one-sided legislature it would be different, but I couldn't tell you for sure because we never tried it. Nebraska is the only state that's ever done it, and while we're the only U.S. state that's done it, all of Canada's provinces are unicameral legislatures at that level. And if you want to talk about other kinds of one-house legislative bodies, think about really any form of local government is a one-house body. And if you want to go private, think about a business. Would they have 2 different boards of directors to decide the same thing? That was an argument made when this was being talked about in Minnesota in the late 90s by the proponents of unicameralism, is that in any other sector of life, we wouldn't have 2 bodies deciding the same thing. So So, believe it or not, Kansas doesn't have as pretty of maps as I have in Nebraska. So these are the kind of the best ones that I could find. But this is how the Kansas Senate looks, which is around 60,000 people per district. And of course, you guys have 40. And this is how your House looks. And again, it's not a great map, but it's the best I could find. But if I just go through these a few times, you can probably see that while the districts are somewhat different, the representatives do generally represent the same area. And again, both of these houses are based on population. You just have one upper house that is supposed to represent a little bit more population, which again, I would argue is just very arbitrary in how it goes about representing. Because even in Kansas, you see like Wichita and Johnson County are very, very powerful at the state level. And again, I mentioned Minnesota. They're probably the most recent state to really very hard consider the unicameral legislature. And that was in the late 90s. They had a lot of debate and ended up failing at the state level. But to talk about $100,000 back in the 30s meant a lot. To try to put it into like more today's terms, again, the 90s is not what it is today, but it's closer. Minnesota estimated that if they were to change the unicameral, they would have saved $20 million annually, which was not a large part of their state budget, but I would again argue that no matter what percentage of the budget it is, $20 million is a pretty big chunk of change that can be used elsewhere better and just not be wasted in a second house doing the same thing that a single house could do. And my last slide here is just the state seal of Nebraska. I just thought it was fitting that our state motto is equality before the law, because it all just gets back to the one person, one vote. That's how our state operates. Every person, we believe, is deserving of the exact same representation. And the unicameral just kind of ensures that, and you don't have two representatives representing the same kind of person in the same kind of way. Yeah, so that's all I have. I'll take questions.
What were the two top issues in Nebraska when the legislature met?
When the legislature met, when?
What would be the two top? They meet annually, right?
Yeah.
Texas, where I'm originally from, we meet once every 2 years for 3 months. So how often does the legislature meet?
They meet every year. It's on even number years, it's 60 days. On odd number years, it's 90 days. A lot of the issues recently have been about the same as they have been nationally. I know that one of the big ones recently was a law banning conversion therapy.
Say again?
A law banning gay conversion therapy was recently being debated in Nebraska. Currently, all the manpower is behind the flooding that's going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
So they're pretty uniform, all in their thoughts right now about needing to put some money.
What? No woman power?
Man meaning human.
Good job.
Michael, as you probably know, there have been a lot of budget cuts to higher education in Nebraska in the last few years. Do you feel like having a unicameral legislature has affected the discussion, either tilting it in a certain direction, or the amount of vetting or consideration that's been done about potential budget cuts in a certain way?
A lot of people do think that the unicameral does limit the amount of consideration put into bills, because they think having two houses, having two different sets of people look at it does help. And I would say it's a valid concern, but Nebraska is very, very careful with how they look at a lot of their legislation. We have mandatory waiting periods before you can vote on things, so that you have to have public debates on everything. We do tend to be intentionally very, very deliberate in talking about every little thing about an issue. Personally, I would say that some of those budget cuts have been more from the governor's agenda than from the legislature's agenda. But that's more my opinion than anything else.
Since the legislature is nonpartisan, do you see more competitive elections?
In some of the districts, yeah. A lot of the districts that are very red, you'll end up with, like I said, two Republicans running against each other. So you do see that more split within the party, where it's not very unified behind all having the exact same policy plans. And you do tend to see, again, in those districts where it's usually pretty uniform, you see a lot of the representatives where they will try to be more centrist, to try to reach across and actually represent the entire district better, because they have to get votes from those who are not affiliated with the same party as them.
So our Constitution, American Constitution, was founded upon the separation of powers. And I've been thinking over the past couple months that the separation of powers has really failed this country over the past couple of years, because a lot of things like immigration reform, stuff like that, has not been passed. And I'm going to give you a few reasons for my opinion, but do you think America should totally revamp its democracy and go for a parliament? And a couple of reasons I think this is because, one, we're so polarized that nothing's getting done in Washington, nothing's happening. I think a second reason, the Supreme Court, I think some of their decisions are based on judicial activism and not based on what most people think. And I like how in Canada, we talked about Canada earlier, their parliament, I believe, has something called parliamentary sovereignty, where they will actually be able to overrule the courts in certain situations if they feel like their decision was really grossly incorrect. Then the third reason is here in Kansas, right now we have a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled legislature. The Republicans are trying to get lower taxes, and Governor Kelly probably won't sign that. And then on the other hand, Governor Kelly's trying to get Medicaid passed and higher funding for schools, and that doesn't look like that's going to go to the legislature or the way she wants it to, at least. And so I feel like a parliament which would allow, the majority opinions to really, be more efficient in that area. So do you think that we should have a parliament?
I would say no, because the way that I look at it is, I think our bigger problem with it is something underlying the system, and it's the voting procedures. I think we can really overhaul that without overhauling the entire style of government. The way that we do first past the post voting, I think creates a lot of the division that you see, because all you have to do is get that 51, and then you don't care about the other 49, because that's not what gets you elected. So I think updating how we do our voting systems, a lot of countries do it where it's like ranked voting or something like that now.
Like instant runoff, is that what you would like?
Something like that, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of options out there for what we could do. I would just say the first past the post is one of the worst, but that's unfortunately what we usually do. I would say you can go about that. I think the other thing is just changing how we do primaries. It's a lot of this at the state level, so it's hard to change fast. But, open versus closed is a pretty big debate. I would certainly argue for open primaries because it allows more centrists into the field to actually get people who are going to represent the most of their constituents. But I would say we need to look at the voting system before we look at the system in general.
Michael, how do you think the gubernatorial perspective is different with the unicameral legislature? Unicameral legislature versus the bicameral. Do you think that a governor would find it to be on the whole more easier or more challenging for the unicameral legislature if it varies too much based on it?
I would think easier because when you have your agenda set, you don't have to work it through two different houses. I mean, we talk about the challenge of getting legislation through two different houses at the federal level, and it really is the same at the state level. Even if it's two houses that are both, say both Republican or both Democrats, you do have people with a few different ideas, and it really is just you have little tiny discrepancies that end up killing a bill if you have two different houses looking at it. So if I was a governor, the unicameral makes more sense because you have to get that one bill through that one house. So you get to deliberate it on it greatly, but you don't have to worry about a discrepancy between what this house wants and what this house wants that completely tanks the entire thing.
Michael, I would say to you, America was designed to be an argument. The bicameral legislature helps to perpetuate that to some extent. I think, as the comment back here suggested, there can be better levels of efficiency and a focus on getting things done. But really, the founding fathers ultimately decided that this was not good to go too fast. Slow down, take your time, have a more deep-seated argument about the issues that we're talking about, and we do that pretty well. Obviously, a variety of contaminating elements like partisanship have kind of screwed that up at times. If the Nebraska unicameral approach is so advantageous, why haven't other states kind of picked up on it? Is it all the politics? Is it simply?
I would say a large part of it is that it's legislators having to legislate out their own jobs. And whenever Nebraska pointed to as an example of how it can work, proponents of bicameralism will say that, well, Nebraska is unique, it wouldn't work here. That is the biggest argument that's made, is that Nebraska is just this unique thing, and their culture is unique, that it wouldn't work anywhere else. And while I love Nebraska, and it was a great place to grow up, we aren't that unique.
Well, I'm just curious if you think the timing of Nebraska's move to a unicameral system versus today would be different too. I mean, I would think, as you were saying, we're a lot more divided today. There's a lot of divisive rhetoric and thinking and polarization, and it just seems like it would be harder to do, job security aside, to make that transition.
Definitely. I mean, it's not going to be any easy task for anyone to undertake in any state. The only thing I want to point out is that a lot of the division and the hyperpartisanship is at the federal level. We don't think about state level being really 100% separate from the federal level at all times. And there are certain federal issues that do bleed into the state level, but there are a lot of things that happen at the state level that are only state issues, that are not federal issues, that are not nearly as hyperpartisan. So I think a lot of it takes realizing on the constituent level that state issues are just really inherently different sometimes than national level issues are. And to go back to what you said about just having the intense deliberation on a lot of this stuff, I would say that unicameral doesn't eliminate a lot of doesn't eliminate the deliberation on it that a second house does. It transfers it to the constituents, because it makes it so that they, like I said, they are more accountable to every single voter, because every vote is out there public, all the discussion is out there public. It makes it so that the general populace is able to be more politically involved and understand what is going on at the state level. So instead of having a second house up there in the state capitol, Topeka, Lincoln, whatever it is, you have the constituents that really get to talk about the issues and really get to have that relationship with the legislature to where they know what's going on, and they get to be the ones that hold them accountable.
You know, just to play devil's advocate a little bit, obviously if you have a bicameral legislature, you're involving more of the population directly into the legislative and governing process. So there might be a case that in Nebraska, not as many people, lay people, have had a chance to serve in state government. But where I'm going at with this is with regard to higher education. You know, a lot of regents oftentimes have been past legislators. You may not know the answer to this, but is the Nebraska Board of Regents generally not as partisan, or are there oftentimes former legislators who are on the regents?
I couldn't tell you.
Okay, so another funky thing that Nebraska does is like their split electoral college votes. Do you think that's rooted in the same type of like consciousness as the unicameral legislature?
I mean, you can say partly. I think a lot of it is that Omaha has such a different thought than the rest of the state. And we're not the only state that does that. Maine does that as well. And it used to be that most states actually did that, where they split their electoral votes. It just got to be where some states realized that if they were to make it winner take all, then their state mattered more. So it became a race to the bottom who got to matter more by doing it first past the post. So we kind of stuck to our guns on it, and I could also argue that part of that is because we only have the 3 electoral votes. So it's just not the same argument as if you try to make the same argument in a Texas or a California or even in a Kansas where you have 5, isn't it? 6. Like it's a small difference, but it's a difference. So when you only have a 3 and you divvy up 1, you can be proud of it, but know that it doesn't greatly impact the outcome of the election.
Do you know if there's a movement out there someplace advocating unicameral legislature? I mean, I could think of Vermont, for example, or Montana, or a number of relatively rural states that probably could adapt something like you're talking about. That's one of the great advantages of federalism. Basically, the states are allowed to experiment and do different kinds of things, and sometimes they're extended experiments, like 1932 for president in Nebraska. Is there some kind of active movement going on someplace?
Nothing very large right now. The latest large one was Minnesota in the late 90s. because it was the governor who, wasn't that Jesse Ventura? But it was whoever that governor was at that time. That was like part of his platform when he ran, that he wanted a unicameral. But it's just not something that's come up really recently as like a very big issue in people's minds. It's not something they thought about as like an idea, a way to change things and cut costs, because we've gotten so caught up in the national issues. At least in my opinion, that's what I think it is. There, you see little things spring up here and there of like senators who are for it, but it's just so far out of the thought process of most states at this point that there's not any large movements.
So you could leave us with a URL that we could Google those, if there isn't anything that organized? Either?
Not that I found right now, which is why it was decently hard to find a New York Times article that was that leaked up to the unicameral legislature.
How many votes does it take to override a veto in the unicameral?
2/3 majority.
2/3.
Do you think that states that are looking at least Colorado, I don't know about the rest, that are looking at trying to get rid of the electoral college, do you think they might go down that path and it might lead to more interest in that, or go
One
the
thing
other
I'll say
way, or
is
not matter?
they aren't looking at getting rid of it, they're looking at reforming how they go about distributing their electors. I assume you're talking about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact that Colorado just signed into law. And again, I think that's more of a federal thing than it is a state thing. I mean, I think it does generally show the idea of going more towards one person, one vote, which is kind of a big part of the Supreme Court decisions that have made unicameralism more appealing as a system. But I think it's dangerous to just assume that everything that happens at the national level is the exact same level important at the state level, and that everything at the state level is inherently a national issue. I think that the entire purpose of the states having their own state governments is that there's going to be issues that are inherent to that state only, that are going to exist only there, and that's what the state legislatures are for.
This requires opinion more than anything else, but usually candidates come forth at the national level and the presidency with some kind of policy advocacy. Take our climate change easily from Washington, whatever. Could you see a Democrat getting into the press and saying, I advocate a unicameral legislature, and lay out all of the advantages that you've laid out to some extent and making some sense out of it to the populace?
Depends on the state. I could honestly argue that I could see it from either party, just depending on where they're from. Whatever, like I said, George Norriss was a New Deal Republican. So I don't think it's an inherently Democratic idea or Republican idea. Democratic in the party, not in the political idea. But
And that's kind of what I was getting at, and I remembered that as you were talking about it, or responding, that he was a New Deal Republican, which is kind of an interesting combination.
I think
He
really
was defeated for re-election. I Googled it.
Sure.
Honestly, I just think any fiscally conservative kind of legislature who wants to kind of try to cut costs and make government more efficient in any way that they can, if they were to look into this, they'd probably be for it. But I would also say that, again, at the national level, they're probably thinking that they have bigger fish to fry. Because, like I said, well, $20 million in Minnesota is nothing to slouch about. That's nothing compared to what they do at the federal level.
So what about Ben Sass?
Ben's house is generally focused on a lot of the federal stuff that I see, and as of right now, I know that he's like back in Nebraska, that he's focusing on the flood stuff.
So he's never talked about it.
This is just another question. Do you think that the federal government is entrenching on states' rights right now? Like some of the things, like I'll just bring something up, and I don't have an opinion on it, but it's just the first thing that popped into my head is marijuana. So Colorado legalized it, but it's illegal on the federal level. So do you think that, just in general, do you think that states can basically do whatever they want if it doesn't have anything to do with the First Amendment of the Constitution?
Well, I wouldn't say the states can do whatever they want. We do have the overarching like federal laws for a reason. There are certain standards we want across the board that are outside of just what is in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. I would say that states in general seem like are much less autonomous than they were at the founding. The best example I have is something I've heard in multiple political science classes, where like when we were the colonies and when we were first founded as a country, it was the United States are, and now it's the United States is, because we see it as one collective instead of a bunch of different states. You know, if you asked George Washington where he was from, he would have said Virginia before he said the United States. And that has really switched recently. We tend to see generally as a populace that the state level government is just an extension of the federal level at our local home area, which is not what it was intended to be. But we just tend to think that with the interconnectedness of the entire nation, that the state level is not nearly as autonomous as they thought it was going to be when they first founded the different levels.
Or our poor humans just had bad grammar.
Just one point, because I heard Elizabeth Warren today on a soundbite say she wants to abolish the electoral college and just go by popular vote. And Nancy Pelosi announced she's for lowering the voting age to 16. So there's a lot of extremism out there one way or the other.
Yeah. And I think a lot of those things do happen to be with decently partisan reasons behind it. You know, a national popular vote.
Really?
A national popular vote obviously would have benefited the Democrats in the last election, and it has been argued that you know, had Bush lost in 2000 or 2004, then we probably would have gotten rid of the electoral college by now. And that's a very, very likely theory out there. If it had swung the other way, where the Democrats won without a popular vote, then it probably would have happened at this point.
And to your issue about being so at each other, you're too young to remember the war in Vietnam.
That's true.
That was like really at one another, because if you didn't get your grades, dude, you were drafted.
Once you had bone spurs in your ankle.
You could have bone spurs.
Pardon me? You get what?
You could have had
Bone
bone
spurs.
spurs.
Bone spurs, yes. I think I have that, Larry, but I'm 67.
You're smart.
But I think one of the biggest things with not having a very, very prominent national figure being a proponent for the unicameral is that it's not inherently greater for one part or the other, and that's a lot easier to argue for a very, very large partisan at the national level. Because if it doesn't necessarily benefit you as a whole, and it's just something that could probably make things more efficient and better, then you don't need to spend your time arguing on it. It's not going to greatly affect you. Like I said, this happened in Nebraska. Nebraska is a pretty red state, but it hasn't necessarily enhanced Republican ideology or power within the state. It just was really genuinely brought in as an idea of how to make the state government better. And maybe pessimistically, I'd say, unfortunately, nowadays it seems to be more about how can my party in the state be better, not how can my state be better. Any more questions? I think that's all I got for you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.